Well, ladies and gentlemen, we do have major updates regarding the current situation in eastern Ukraine. Breaking news: NATO now discussing the possibility of preemptive strikes against Russia. So we already had NATO giving all the missiles to Ukraine. That was triggered right after Trump won the election. It was like they realized they were up against the clock once Trump takes over, and now they want to jam everything down and try and authorize everything to be used against Russia, only escalating the situation. And it could be for a number of different reasons. I've got an interesting article that basically says the exact same thing that I've been saying. I think NATO wants to give Ukraine as much leverage as possible, but that also comes with risks of escalation, as we've seen. And I'm sure they expect it. I mean, they've got the intel, you would think, to understand that Putin would then escalate it even further. But the thought is that we can escalate this, we meaning NATO, we can allow Ukraine to escalate this without the threat of nuclear war, because I guess their intel is saying that Russia is not going to go to nuclear war. I do not believe that the United States and even the current regime wants to go to World War III over NATO. I think the problem is the current Democratic Party is ceding the power of NATO and putting in the hands of those European countries because the war is happening closer to them, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you are having an America First policy and you care about the United States and not going to World War III over that, because that would hurt everybody, not just the countries that World War III would be directly involved in. And then obviously you would have the trickle down effect. It wouldn't just be Russia and the World War III happening in Eastern Europe. You would very likely also have China doing things. You would have North Korea. They are already helping Russia as is. And you would also have the Middle East be totally unstable. It already is unstable. It's always unstable, but now it's even worse. And then you're talking about going into World War III. A lot of those countries are going to become very opportunistic when it comes to potential wars, especially when the United States and some of the other countries that try and keep those countries in check there in the Middle East, although we know how that works out. I think the United States should just leave the Middle East for good, although I don't have any ties to Israel. It's going to get very, very bad, let's just say, if all of this stuff starts to happen. It's a trickle-down effect, especially if World War III starts in Eastern Europe. But when it comes to this, look, NATO is really escalating things, and they know that Trump's coming in. They know that there's going to be a deal. And I did see this article, and I would imagine you can see Biden's Ukraine moves are a gift to Trump. I haven't read this yet, but I would imagine this is mainly about the idea of giving Ukraine leverage in a negotiation of peace when Trump gets in. You can see it says the United States and other partners of Ukraine need to increase their support to Kyiv now to improve Trump's chances at negotiating a Ukraine deal worth having. And again, that's all well and good as long as Putin doesn't escalate the situation further significantly. I mean, because the situation was always going to be escalated once the United States allowed the use of their missiles by Ukraine onto Russia. And France has also allowed it. And now we've got the whole thing about what about the troops going there? I mean, it's very clear, in my opinion. I still have faith that Trump will be able to work out a peace deal. And I think a lot of this is NATO intelligence and the European NATO countries understanding that there's no way Putin wants actual direct war with NATO. That's a risk, but I'm guessing their intelligence is saying it's not something that Putin really wants. This is more so a 21st century warfare bluff by Putin to go into Ukraine. And look, when it comes to the whole idea of, oh, the war situation for Russia is terrible, they thought it was going to be a lot better, we can really only speculate on that. But I would imagine, yes, the situation in Ukraine is not going to plan. They thought that they were going to take a lot more land in a lot shorter of amount of time, and they've lost a lot of resources in eastern Ukraine that they didn't think they were going to lose, including manpower. And so you've also got that. So if the thing is, it just comes down to leverage. How much leverage does Russia have? How much leverage does Ukraine have going into a potential peace deal? And the reason that this headline would be what it is, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would this be a gift? You're just escalating the war. It's a gift because the idea is that it gives Ukraine leverage and NATO backing going into a negotiating period with Russia. And if Russia is threatened by NATO, they're more likely to cede more things when it comes to a negotiation. Now, I still don't think they're going to cede any of the land that they already have. Obviously, the only way that gets ceded is probably World War III happening and NATO having an offensive there with their troops from various NATO European countries. I don't know if the United States troops would be involved in that. But the thing is, with Trump, it seems like he wants no part of this at all. And he wants to isolate this war to Eastern Europe as opposed to NATO wanting to bring the European countries in NATO wanting to bring everyone into this war and say it's a team effort against Russia. And that's mainly because of where they're located. And there's always going to be this little battle, this tug of war between the United States and the European NATO countries, especially with Russia and where it's located, landlocked with Europe, and the European countries feeling a lot more threatened by Russia. Although we can argue that, and to be fair, we're not the ones that Russia is really going to target, in missile strikes, so they're going to feel a lot more threatened. I understand that, and obviously Russia, that's a problem that's not going away for any of those European NATO countries as well. But I do think this situation, if this doesn't force, along with Trump, who's going to come in, and we already knew what he did his first term, he pressured those European countries heavily to increase their military budgets. I only think they're going to increase them even more now, on top of the idea of being threatened by Russia. And whether, whatever happens with this peace deal, unfortunately, it's probably going to be seen as appeasement to Russia no matter what. And it's like, well, when it comes to countries getting certain land, it's very similar to China trying to take Taiwan. The United States has just never been in a position like this. You see a lot of Americans saying, well, that's Ukraine's land. Well, based on what? I mean, it's like, it was it was the Soviet Union's land back in 1981. I mean, it's like, I don't know, man. I understand, invading a country is bad and we don't want it to happen, but it's just like this whole idea of it. No, it's their land based on what? Like the borders that were drawn in 91. It's like, it's not from a Russian perspective. It's understandable. Imagine the United States lost Alaska in 1991. We want Alaska back. We want the resources back. We're going to go invade Alaska to take it back from Russia. We've just never been in that position. So, I don't know. We'll have to see what ends up happening when it comes to this. But I do think, listen, I can understand where this article is coming from, talking about giving, but it's really just a risk assessment on whether or not you think Putin's going to escalate it to the point of no return. And if that happens, then this entire charade was a total disaster that's going to very likely cost millions of lives, because you're talking about entering World War III over betting Putin will not escalate even after you escalated by giving Ukraine the missiles, and now talking about giving Ukraine nuclear warheads. So if that escalates into World War III, of course, the main culprit will be Putin because he was the one to initially invade Ukraine. But let's not forget this type of stuff that's happening as well, to where this war was basically in a total standstill, and it seems like it becomes a hot war again once Trump wins. Notice the difference. It seemed like NATO was really fine with their position, but once Trump gets in, and you've got this window where the Democrats are the lame duck, Biden's the lame duck, and Trump doesn't have the power yet, but he's president-elect. So now they're going full throttle, because my guess is that they don't think Putin wants World War III with NATO. And the question is, would China back Russia in that endeavor? And if they do, does that become the new axis? It's interesting stuff to think about. But yeah, I mean, we're just seeing these updates daily now when it comes to NATO escalation. And we're going to have to see what ends up happening when it comes to this, but this is not good. This is not what we want. And we do want some type of peace deal to be worked out. Whether those regions in Eastern Europe or Eastern Ukraine get annexed, they're very likely going to if a peace deal happens, because I can't see Russia giving up that land outside of some crazy risky maneuvers by NATO. And what I mean by that is it would be giving Ukraine nukes. It would be giving Ukraine soldiers. Now, why is that risky? Because then you're talking about escalation and actual strikes onto NATO European countries by Russia. If that happens, is the next form of escalation. If NATO decides to go on the offensive to try and get some of that land back, or to try and force a better peace deal for Ukraine, it's almost like threading a needle. You want to give Ukraine help if you are the Eastern European countries, because you don't want them to go into a negotiating period with basically nothing. So it's like, that's why NATO's saying, we're in the ball game, we're in this for the long run, we are going to help Ukraine, we're showing it, we're showing what we can do, we're giving them missiles, We're going to allow them to fire them into Western Europe, into Western Russia. Okay, so when we go to a peace deal, you have to understand the idea is you don't want Russia to have all the leverage to the point where it's like Ukraine has to agree to a peace deal or else they're screwed. Because if that's the case, then the negotiation is going to be extremely one-sided for Russia on whatever they want. You want it to be almost 50-50, or for NATO, those European countries, they want it to be more so in Ukraine's favor. And, if you're an American, you do understand the Europeans. Listen, what's happened to those European nations, it is very, very sad. It's extremely bad. I do think some of them are waking up with all of the immigrants invading and a lot of the government siding with the immigrants. It's totally unacceptable. And I think a lot of the citizens, the natural born citizens there, realize that. And there's some pushback. You see what's happening in the UK. But, I want those European countries to be allies with the United States. That's where a lot of us, our lineages were originally from. But there is obviously some serious problems with those countries and how liberal they've gotten. A lot of them are, way more liberal than Canada. Now Canada's going more right wing. Now Trudeau is trying to make amends and talk nicey nice with Trump, although that's for a number of different reasons. That's because Canada has to. And the United States doesn't want any problems with Canada, but we know Canada's gone pretty far left, and it seems like they're kind of circling back, at least to moderate right. We'll have to see what happens with their election. I believe October of 2025 is their election. And to me, this is just more of the same. And it's like, how far can NATO push Russia before you push them over the edge? But then it's like, dude, like when you argue with these people, there's really no winning, because no matter what NATO does, they're just going to blame Putin. And I understand it. I get it. But there has to be more nuance than that, man. Like, seriously, we're going to push Russia over the edge over protecting areas in Ukraine. And a lot of those European countries are like, yes, because it's so scary. But the United States, our perspective is no, that's not worth it. Not right now. It's not. And then they compare it to Nazi Germany. It's just such a false equivalency. So it's like, I know, I understand what Putin did was bad. He shouldn't have done it. But the idea that it's just, oh my God, no matter what NATO does in response, World War III is always just going to be Putin's fault no matter what. Well, listen, if NATO keeps escalating things, you're kind of asking for it at this point. And I know it's like, oh, you can't say that. But it's more nuanced than to just say, oh, this is totally Putin's fault. When you're and especially this is like a dead giveaway. Like, Trump wins, the war is just, it's been halted for like 2 years. I mean, not literally, there's been things going on obviously, but compared to what we saw with the original offensive back in February, I believe, of 2022, compared to where we were right before the election, and then the election happens, oh boy, Trump is coming in. He's cutting off aid to Ukraine. Zelensky's meeting with Trump. They're talking about doing a peace deal. Zelensky is on record saying a peace deal is going to happen. And now let's give them all the weapons. Now let's escalate it even further. And again, my speculation is that I think it's to give them more leverage in a peace negotiation. But still, you're playing with fire. Hopefully their intelligence is correct, because I don't believe, like, if you're sitting there saying, if we escalate this, if NATO escalates this, then there's a chance, a serious chance, that Russia is going to escalate this into potentially not even nuclear bombs, but strikes against European countries. I don't think they would do it. I think they must have rock solid intelligence that says Putin is totally bluffing. The war in Ukraine for Putin, the Eastern campaign has gone horrible, and they're just trying to salvage as much land as humanly possible. Let's not give them that leverage going into negotiations. So let's show that NATO is fully behind Ukraine. So when Ukraine goes into the negotiations, they will have NATO fully behind them, and it will not be something to where Ukraine has to do a deal, because if they don't get the deal they want, they can say, we're just going to keep fighting. We've got Ukraine behind us. But really, how many men do they have? Now, listen, there's a lot of crap going around. I've heard people say Russia's running out of men. Ukraine is running out of men. I think if it's just Russia against Ukraine, Russia's going to win 100 times out of 100, let's be honest. But if NATO is there to help, but at what point do NATO troops come in? See, this is what doesn't make any sense to me. At the end of the day, Ukraine, they're just going to be exhausted. They're going to run out of manpower. So then what happens next? Then do NATO troops start fighting? I don't know, man. We're going to have to see how this whole thing works out. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.